but an astonishing humiliation, a complete wipeout of an entire army. And there was a great wash of books and memoirs which followed, examining this and why this had happened. As one of the army chaplains of the Jalalabad garrison wrote, "It was a war begun for no wise purpose, carried on with a strange mixture of rashness and timidity, brought to a close after suffering and disaster, without much glory attached either to the government that directed or the great body of troops which waged it. Not one benefit, political or military, has been acquired by this war. Our eventual evacuation of the country resembled the retreat of an army defeated." This, of course, didn't stop the lesson failing to be learnt, and it is a lesson which has failed to be learnt over and over again. When the Second Afghan War began 40 years later, one of the last survivors, someone who'd been taken hostage by Wazir Akbar Khan and who escaped, George Lawrence, wrote a letter to the Times and wrote, "A new generation has arisen, which, instead of profiting from the solemn lessons of the past, is willing and eager to embroil us again in the affairs of that turbulent and unhappy country. Although military disasters may be avoided, an advance into Afghanistan now, however successful from a military point of view, would not fail to turn out to be politically useless. The disaster of the retreat from Kabul should stand forever as a warning to statesmen of the future not to repeat the policies that bore such bitter fruit in 1839 to 42. Now, there was a folk memory of this failure which lived on among politicians in Britain until recent times. It's alleged that Alec Douglas Hume, assuming office as Prime Minister in the 1950s, asked his predecessor, Macmillan, if he had any advice for him as he became Prime Minister. Macmillan apparently said, "Dear boy, as long as you don't invade Afghanistan, you'll probably be fine." You just wish, reading the documents for this book, that you just had sort of 10 minutes of history lesson to give to George Bush or Tony Blair all those years ago, just to explain that invading Afghanistan is not a great idea, that there's better things they can do with their money, but sadly no one did. What's interesting also, reading the correspondence of the time, sitting in Anarkali, in the Punjab archives, going through this documentation, is again not just the outline of this catastrophic invasion, it's the issues that the statesmen are writing about. Also the way that the war is begun. In 1839, the rumor of a single Russian envoy visiting Kabul is exaggerated and manipulated by a group of ambitious and ideologically driven hawks to create a scare, a phantom. In this case, the phantom Russian invasion. And you find the same letters being written again. John McNeill, the very incendiary British ambassador in Tehran, writes, "We should declare that he who is not with us is against us. We must secure Afghanistan." Then there's the issue of, once you've actually conquered this country, do you try and import your ideal system? On the way in, the British spy master, the head of the equivalent of MI5 of the time, Sir Claude Wade, writes a letter saying, "There is nothing more to be dreaded or guarded against, I think, than the overweening confidence which we are too often accustomed to regard the excellence of our own institutions, and the anxiety that we display to introduce them into new and untried soils. Such interference will always lead to acrimonious disputes, if not a violent reaction." Of course, nobody listened. And then you get these wonderful letters all over again from the men on the ground. There's a guy who's sent out to Herat to try and make friends with the wazir there. And he writes back anxiously because the wazir, who is his ally, has begun boiling alive his enemies as a way of raising funds. He says, "The culprit is put to torture. The commonest means to being by boiling or roasting alive or baking on a slow fire. The horrible ingenuities practiced on these occasions are too disgusting to be more than alluded to. The wretch, writhing in agony, gradually disgorges his wealth and learns just before he dies that his wives and daughters have been sold to the Turkomans or divided among the sweepers and servants of the city. Of recent victims, one was half roasted, then cut into very small pieces, the other parboiled and afterwards baked. Now this, of course, echoes the famous dispatches sent by Craig Money from Uzbekistan, who questioned why we should be supporting Karimov when he started boiling alive his people, and was told just to shut up and get on, and he's an ally. He's our chap. So the book opens with a wonderful scene. I want you to imagine yourself on the borderlands between Herat and Meshed, this wild country even today. Even today, wolves in winters, only opium smugglers crossing this very wild country between what's now northern Iran and the western edge of Afghanistan. And a young British scholar called Henry Rawlinson, who is the man who will later go on to transcribe and crack the ancient Persian script, has been riding for a week from the west of the country to the Shah's camp near Meshed. And exhausted, in the middle of the night, he loses the road. And he's got lost in these very wild mountains. And just as dawn is coming up over the Shah Jahan mountains, where there are famous turquoise mines, he sees, just as dawn is rising, this party of horsemen heading down this wild country towards him. And he doesn't know whether they're brigands or who these guys are. And he hides himself and his party into a little side gully before he's spotted. And he sees cantering down the defile a party of Russian Cossacks wearing their Cossack uniform. Now he realizes he's onto something else. There should be no Cossacks in northern Iran at this point, and they're heading into Afghanistan. And so he follows this guy, and he makes a shortcut through the mountains and arrives to find the party of Cossacks breakfasting beside a stream on the Afghan border. And this wonderful conversation goes on between him and the blonde Russian, as he assumes, who is leading this party. And they try talking, first of all, in Persian, then they try Chagatai Turkish, and then they try Russian and French. And eventually, they agree to discuss what they're both doing in this wild spot in Chagatai Turkish. And he immediately rides back to Tehran to report the presence of the Russian Cossacks in this remote place. And this sets off a scare. This one sighting of a party of Russians. It turns out, in fact, it is a in Whitehall. And an army is dispatched. It's collected in Firozpur, in the Punjab. And within 9 months of this sighting of these Cossacks, 14,000 East India Company sepoys, 21,000 troops in all, 30,000 camels. One brigadier has 50 camels to carry his kit. One regiment brings their own pack of foxhounds into war with them. According to General Nott, who's a plain-spoken farmer's son, many young officers would have soon have left behind their swords and double-barreled pistols as to march without their dressing cases, their perfumes, their Windsor soap, and their eau de cologne. One regiment has 2 camels carrying Manila cigars, while other camels carry jams, pickles, cheroots, potted fish, smoked salmon, hermetically sealed meats, plates, crockery, wax candles, and table linen. And so this huge army heads on up the Bolan Pass. More difficult then. There you can just get the train from Quetta and head off through it. But before the railway was built, very rugged territory with no wells. And they almost die in the crossing of the Bolan Pass. The Baluchis snipe at them. They get attacked near Kalat. But half dead, they make their way into Afghanistan. And so surprised are the Afghans to see this enormous army coming through the Bolan into the back of Kandahar. The Sardars of Afghanistan flee. And as with more recent wars, the British find it relatively easy to march into Afghanistan and establish themselves. The difficulty is what happens next. For 6 months, it all looks as if it's going very easily, as if it's been an easy conquest. The naysayers who said it was going to be a difficult thing to invade Afghanistan have to keep quiet. The hawks are triumphant. And the Memsahibs arrive. Lady Sale turns up and plants her kitchen garden in Kabul. My sweet peas and geraniums were much admired, she says. and in the kitchen garden, the potatoes especially thrive. They introduce cricket and horse racing and open-air amateur theatricals to Kabul. And when winter draws in, there's snipe shooting, duck shooting, skating, and snowman building. The foxhounds are taken out daily to hunt jackals, and the British, one of the two British ambassadors, Sir Alexander Burns, throws a Christmas party with Scottish reels, bagpipes, and wears his kilt. And it all looks as if it's going to be an easy conquest. And then, of course, the jihad begins. And it begins in the south, it begins in Helmand, in Kandahar, and it works its way north. The man who the British have placed on the throne, Shah Shuja, is a Popalzai, which is from the very same sub-tribe as President Karzai. We put the same guy in twice. He is exposed as a muli, a radish, as the Afghans call puppets. Gradually the British find themselves surrounded in a narrower and narrower ring, as so many subsequent invasions, stuck in Kabul, unable to get out, surrounded on all sides. A familiar situation. And then there's this revolt in Kabul, which throws the whole thing into complete chaos. It happened by God's will, wrote Mirza Atta. And again, one of the things that's been most exciting working on this book has been to find all the incredible Afghan and sources from this part of the world. There are 10 full-length histories of this war in Dari that have turned up between the Indian National Archives, between the Punjab Archives in Lahore, between the archives in Kabul, and various libraries in the country. 3 full-length epic poems, an Akbarnama dedicated to Wazir Akbar Khan, a Jangname, an autobiography of Shah Shuja, and all these incredible sources have been there all these years, but unused by English-speaking historians. They are well known to Afghan historians writing in Dari, but have never been used before by anyone writing in English. And they're fantastically lively stuff. One of my favorite is by a Afghan courtier from Shikarpur on the Indus. And he gives a wonderful account, Mirza Atta, he's called. It happened by God's will, he writes, that a slave girl of Abdullah Khan Achaksai ran away from his house to the residence of Alexander Burns. When on inquiry, it was found out that was where she had gone. The Khan, beside himself with fury, sent an attendant to fetch the silly girl back. But the Englishman, swollen with pride, cursing and swearing, had the Khan's attendant severely beaten and thrown out of the house. The Khan then summoned the other Sardars and said, "Now we are justified in throwing off the English yoke. They stretch the hand of tyranny to dishonor private citizens, great and small. Making love to a slave girl isn't worth the ritual bath that follows it. But we have to stop here right now, otherwise the English will drive the donkey of their lust into the field of stupidity, to the point of having us all arrested and deported into foreign imprisonment. I put my trust in God and raise the battle standard of the Prophet Muhammad, and thus go to fight. If success rewards us, then it is as we wished. If we die in battle, it is better still that way than to live with degradation and dishonor." The other Sardars, his childhood friends, tightened their belts and girt their loins and prepared for jihad. And so the same familiar pattern develops. Alexander Burns is trapped in his house in the city of Kabul, comes out and is hacked to death in the street. McNaughton goes out, the other ambassador goes out to negotiate with Wazir Akbar Khan, is shot, hacked to death, and his head used as a football by the little boys of Kabul. And then this great retreat takes place. Having been lost their supply fort within the first 2 days of the uprising, the British are starved into submission, and they surrender, hand over their weapons, and 18,000 men in the middle of winter set out from Kabul on the 6th of January, 1841. At 9 a.m., the troops moved off. This is George Lawrence writing. A crouching, drooping, dispirited army, so different from the smart, light-hearted body of men that appeared some time ago. The men sinking a foot deep in snow with each step. My heart sunk within me under the conviction that we were a doomed force. My own great-uncle was on the retreat, and he, in his memoirs, wrote that he always remembered as one of the most heart-rending sights that day, fixing his eyes by chance on a little Hindustani child, perfectly naked, sitting on the snow, with no mother or father near it. It was a beautiful little girl, about 2 years old, just strong enough to sit upright with its little legs doubled underneath it, hair curling in waving locks in its soft little throat. Its great black eyes, dilated twice their normal size, fixed on the armed men, the passing cavalry, and the strange sights that met its gaze. Many other children as young as innocent he saw slain on the road, and the women with their long dark hair wet with their own blood. The rear guard, this is still Colin Mackenzie writing, the rear guard had to fight the whole way to Bagrami, where the airport is now, and pass through a literal continuous line of poor wretches, women and children, dead or dying from colds or wounds, who, unable to move, entreated their comrades to kill them and put an end to their misery. This scene goes on. Lady Sale, she of the kitchen garden, has her son-in-law shot in front of her. Her pregnant daughter is shot. She says, "I fortunately had only one ball in the arm. 3 others passed through my poshteen near the shoulder without doing me any injury." The pass completely choked up, and for a considerable period we were stationary under heavy fire. By the 3rd day of the retreat, 15,000 people are dead. We came across, Lady Sale is taken hostage by Wazir Akbar Khan, and traveling with the Afghans sees the aftermath of the massacres. We came upon more bloody scenes. Sepoys and camp followers were being stripped and plundered on all sides, and such as refused to give money and valuables were instantly stabbed or cut down. On seeing us, the poor creatures cried out for help, many of them recognizing me and calling me by name. But what could we do? The Ghilzais had now tasted blood and clearly showed their tigerish nature, becoming very savage and fierce in their demeanor. They said, "You came to Kabul for fruit, did you? How do you like it now?" As we proceeded, we were met by numbers of the enemy's horse returning to Kabul laden with plunder of all kinds. One miscreant had a little Indian girl seated on his horse beside him. By day 5, 12,000 are dead and only 200 still living. 2 days after that, it's down to one man. Dr. Bryden,